Remember, complex numbers are written in the form a plus or minus bi, where a is the real part and b is the imaginary part. So when we go to add and subtract complex numbers, we're going to add the real parts, because those are like terms, and then we'll be able to add the imaginary parts, or subtract if it asks you to subtract. So imaginary and imaginary. So that's what we're going to do on 1A. I will color code the real parts in blue. So -2 and 3, those are the real parts. And in pink, I'll put the imaginary parts, 4i and -11i. Keep in mind, we have this plus sign right in the middle. So we're not going to forget this is an addition problem. So now I'm going to go ahead and add the like terms. So I'm going to write -2 plus 3, because those are the real parts and there's a plus sign in between. And then I'm going to add the imaginary parts. It's a positive 4i, and I'm going to add the -11i. So let's add. -2 plus 3 is 1, and 4i plus -11i is -7i. And that is in the proper complex number form with the real part first and the imaginary part second, so that's the final answer. Try the U-try and see if you can come out with the correct answer. Hopefully you came out with 9 for the real part and then plus 7i for the imaginary part. In front of that negative I right there is a 1, so you're doing -1 plus 8. That's where positive 7 comes from. We will do the same thing, except for this time notice that this is a subtraction problem. So we're going to subtract the real parts. We will do -4 minus 2, and we will do I, positive 1i, minus -9i. So -4 minus 2 is 6. 1 minus -9 is like 1 plus 9, so that will be plus 10i. See if you can try the U-try. Here you should get -8, because 1 minus 9 is -8, and -1i, I forgot to write the I, it's a -1i, minus 3i is -4i. Remember what the square root of -1 is? If you have a negative sign, then you have an I on the outside. So I is the square root of -1. And if you were to square both sides, if you were to square the I and square the square root, you would be left with I squared equaling, the square would cancel out the square root, and you'd be left with -1. So what we're going to do, anytime we see an I squared, we're going to cross it out, and in its place, we will substitute a -1. And my advice to you is to write it inside parentheses, because you will be multiplying by -1, not subtracting 1 from the numbers. So once you do that, you'll simplify by multiplying whatever number it's next to by -1. So let's try that. We are going to multiply. We have a number out front, so we need to distribute it to what's inside the parentheses. So 2 times 3 is 6 with an I. Just treat that I like you would an X. If it was 2x times 3, it'd be 6x. And then 2 times -5 is -10, and I times I is I squared. Just like x times x is x squared, I times I is I squared. So since we have an I squared, we're going to cross it out, and I'm going to write a -1 right next to it. Now we just need to simplify. We have 6i, and the -1 gets multiplied by the -10 that it's right next to. We totally ignore the I squared now. So -10 times -1 is +10. The last thing we should do to be super correct is flip-flop the answers so the real part's first and the imaginary part is second. Hopefully you distributed and got negative 9i plus 6i squared. Cross out the I squared, and you're left with negative 9i minus 6 because positive 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. So the last thing we should do is flip-flop so the negative 6 is first and then the minus 9i is second. Since we have a 2 by 2, we can either FOIL or box, so I'll just FOIL this first example. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 4 is 12 with an I. Negative 5 times 2 is negative 10 with an I. And negative 5 times positive 4 is negative 20. I times I is I squared. So let's clean this up a little bit. I do have some like terms I can combine. So I have 6. 12 minus 10 is 2. So that all turns into plus 2i. And now I see that I squared, so I'm crossing it out and putting a negative 1 next to it in parentheses. That means I multiply negative 20 times negative 1. That will be plus 20. So again, let's simplify and collect our like terms. I'm going to combine 6 and 20. That's 26. And then I'll put the 2i after. And that is in proper complex number form, the real parts first and the imaginary parts second. You could also do the box method with that problem and come out with the same final answer. I'll give you a hint on this last problem. 3i squared means that we have 3i times 3i. So this one actually isn't as long as having to FOIL or box. 3 times 3 is 9. I times I is I squared. And let's cross out that I squared, replace it with a negative 1. And 9 times negative 1 is negative 9. So that's it for the answer here.